Good evening. Today we'll be talking about green burial in New York City, overcoming barriers to changes in the 21st century death industry. My name is Debbie Einhorn.
I'm Brendan Cupador.
My name is Alex Young.
We chose to work on this because we have read not only New York City's sustainability plan, but sustainability plans from other cities as well, and none of them speak about how to make disposition more environmentally friendly. The problem is approximately 56,000 people die in New York City every year, but there are only two disposition methods available, burial and cremation. Neither of these options, as conventionally practiced, are sustainable options. We are investigating barriers to practicing green burial in New York City. A possible solution is to expand the area available for burial by using parks and possibly brownfields.
The Green Burial Council defines green burial as burying the body without embalming, using only biodegradable containers and shrouds. No vaults or grave liners are allowed, and no pesticides can be used on the grounds. There are three types of green burial: conservation burial grounds, which have the strictest guidelines out of the three, natural burial grounds, and hybrid burial grounds. Other green disposition methods are available in other states and countries, which include cremation, which is freeze drying of the body, which is then shaken to reduce to a fine powder; alkaline hydrolysis, which is a water and alkaline chemical treatment that produces a sterile effluent; anaerobic decomposition, where the body is placed in a container without oxygen to be digested by microorganisms; and natural organic reduction, which is composting of the body.
Is green burial really more sustainable than standard burial? Short answer is yes. The long answer is standard burial uses tons of steel, copper, bronze, concrete, as well as millions of gallons of embalming fluid, pesticide, fertilizer, and water, millions of feet of hardwood, and is energy intensive. Green burial doesn't use any metals or embalming fluid and limits the amount of pesticide, fertilizer, water, and energy used. Including production and transportation of products, a standard burial emits 169 kilograms of carbon emissions, while green burial emits a negligible amount.
Our procedure began with a literature review. Several sources were critical: Elizabeth Fournier's The Green Burial Guidebook, Anya Marsh's The Law of Human Remains, and Columbia University's 2016 colloquium, Designing for Life and Death, Sustainable Disposition and Spaces of Remembrance in the 21st Century Metropolis. They aided our initial hypotheses in finding barriers to environmentally friendly disposition methods in New York City. Among potential barriers, limitations of physical space, laws or health codes that explicitly deny green burial within city limits, and specific considerations of stakeholders, such as cemetery owners or funeral directors, regarding pricing or required changes, came to the foreground in our research. We also wanted to gauge public opinion regarding green burial and individuals' disposition choices for themselves or loved ones, and even if they were aware or had thought of these practices. We conducted interviews with individuals in the field, legislators, funeral directors, and religious leaders to gain a fuller understanding of the cultural, legal, and financial issues that might emerge with a change to green burial. And finally, we conducted 3 abbreviated case studies of parks where green burials could potentially take place: Corona Meadows Park in Queens, Rushfield Park on Staten Island, and Hart Island in the Bronx. We shared our findings in a brief presentation at the American Museum of Natural History's Student Conference on Conservation Science in October. New York City's health codes and public laws do not ban green burial outright. However, they favor strict funeral director oversight and control regarding the process of how we inter our loved ones. This concentration of power leaves consumers vulnerable to predatory selling practices at a time when individuals and families are grieving and at their most raw. One big step toward granting NYC more burial space would be to amend sepulcher laws, which today guarantee a resting place in perpetuity. As in many other countries, a burial plot can be recycled after a period of time, say 25 years, unless family members continue to lay claim to it. New York corporate laws specify that funeral homes must be for-profit corporations. This business model is problematic, as it encourages funeral directors to promote expensive caskets, embalming, and other unsustainable practices simply to make a profit. Cemeteries must be not-for-profit, run for the public good. This de-incentivizes cemetery owners from allowing forms of green burial, which would drastically increase the maintenance cost of their plots. Within legislative bounds and cemetery regulations requiring vaults, people can opt for shades of green, that is, no embalming and a biodegradable casket in a hybrid cemetery.
We found that there are no religious barriers for Christians, Jews, Muslims, and the unaffiliated. The only religious group that would not be able to practice green burial on religious grounds are Buddhists and Hindus. Buddhists and Hindus make up approximately 3% of New York City's population. That means for 97% of the population, there are no religious barriers to performing green burial. Consumer attitudes. For the consumers, there are three main barriers to practicing green burial: education, affordability, and accessibility. Regarding education, if a person does not know what green burial is, then they cannot ask for it. If they do know what green burial is and they do ask for it, then the next barrier they face is affordability. Under current circumstances, buying a burial plot in New York City is very expensive, typically upwards of $9,000. If they cannot afford the plot, they will not be able to afford any burial in New York City. If they can afford the plot, then the next barrier is accessibility. Currently in New York City, there are no certified green burial cemeteries. So if they wanted a certified green burial, they would be forced to go out of the city, which adds carbon emissions due to transportation. In a case where a person is forced to choose between a distant green burial and a local burial, they will choose a local burial. According to the National Funeral Directors Association, nearly 54% of people are in favor of green burial. And according to our CCNY survey, it was 84%. But just because someone is in favor of it doesn't mean they will choose it in the end because of the barriers mentioned above. These pie charts come from our CCNY survey. As you can see in the upper left chart, the data is skewed towards people who are more sustainably inclined. Even so, only about 50% knew about green burial before they took the survey. Nevertheless, by the end of the survey, about 80% said they would suggest green burial to their loved ones. The chart at the bottom right shows that about 2/3 of people surveyed would be okay with a mixed-use cemetery and park. Half of them would require a clear distinction between park and cemetery. This suggests that using parks as cemeteries would largely be acceptable to New Yorkers. Funeral directors. Funeral directors enter the profession to help and serve people in their time of need. Therefore, any barrier that exists for the consumer likewise exists for the funeral director. New York State requires that they run their services as a for-profit business. This is a problem because funeral directors then depend on selling goods that are unsustainable for their livelihood. Green burial isn't necessarily bad for business because they are still hired to perform a service. Funeral directors often sell goods that can be described as shades of green. This means that the burial won't be certified green but can still be reasonably sustainable. If a person chooses not to be embalmed and is buried in a biodegradable casket, that is a shade of green and is acceptable and should be encouraged because it allows the consumer to be as green as they are able.
Many cemeteries require vaults and grave liners to stabilize the ground and slow down decomposition. It is not a legal requirement. No cemeteries in New York City currently offer certified green burial, and only few offer burials without vaults. Cemeteries are not legally or morally obligated to educate consumers about raw materials and possible contamination from metals, concrete, and embalming fluids. No urban plans for New York City in recent decades accommodate cemeteries, which is leading to a serious plot shortage estimated as early as 2025. Space is a main concern in New York City, and we found that the most viable solution for new burial grounds is park space currently managed by city government and brownfields, some of which are privately owned. The Parks Department currently oversees 43 square miles of parkland in New York City, and there are an estimated 3,000 plus brownfields, which are previously developed lands currently not in use. They may or may not be filled with contaminants and hazardous waste, and may have potential after determining the level of remediation that is needed. The image on the left shows current cemeteries in New York City, and the image on the right shows the amount of parkland that is managed by the city. After we thought of parks as potential burial grounds, we chose 3 very different spaces in different boroughs to begin to understand specific potential barriers and possibilities. Flushing Meadows Corona Park, located in Queens, Fresh Kills Park, located in Staten Island, and Hart Island in the Bronx. Flushing Meadows Corona Park is the most heavily used park in New York City. It is used for sports, recreation, and the arts and sciences by all age groups and numerous religions. The Parks Department informed us that they would attempt to include burial space in the parks if there is strong advocacy by the public and no major objection from any of the religious groups. The Sikh community has requested to scatter cremains in the past, but they were denied due to concern for contamination of the man-made lakes. Green burial, however, is organic decomposition, but may have other barriers. Testing of the grounds would have to be done to determine appropriate space for burial grounds in the park, including any impact it may have on the soil and water. A natural or hybrid cemetery in the sparsely used section of the park would probably be most viable in this situation, and planning for protection and maintenance of a municipal burial ground in a highly populated area would also be necessary.
Fresh Kills Park is a brilliant example of a local community lobbying the city government for environmentally conscious change. It was a landfill from the 70s into the early 2000s when Staten Islanders lobbied to have the landfill capped, cleaned of any leachate that might have polluted the surrounding soils and waterways, and turned into a park as a model of ecological restoration. Green burial, however, might encounter barriers, first among them cultural issues. The constituents of Staten Island remain politically active and among the most consistently right-leaning voters within NYC. Green burial, while it fits into their goal of being environmentally friendly, could be seen as an affront to the pristine parkland they fought hard to develop. Frank Masha, Chief of Staff for Councilmember Joe Borelli's office, explained that while his constituents were having more cremation services, they would most likely be ignorant of green burial practices. They would also be up in arms at the prospect of dead bodies being buried anywhere on public parkland. He recommended creating a nonprofit organization that would facilitate the process of helping loved ones and families organize green burials in conjunction with newly renovated brownfields or on land recently under the Parks Department jurisdiction. Here is a current view of Fresh Kills Park. The pristine example of ecological restoration may be why Mr. Masha believes local residents would like to see it free of human disposition. However, conservation burial may be an option they could approve. Conservation burials occur in unmarked graves on protected grounds, supported by practices that restore and preserve the ecological integrity of the land. Human remains are already on the land in the form of a now completely covered family burial plot from the early 20th century, and of greater concern may be that this land was once indigenous hunting and fishing grounds, which maintain archaeological and historical certificates at about exactly the depths graves would be dug in certain areas of low altitude.
Hart Island. Hart Island has potential to become a viable long-term green burial ground. Since this city-owned cemetery opened in 1869, it effectively performed green burial, although it is not officially certified. Non-embalmed bodies are buried in pine boxes 3 deep with limited markers. This is extremely sustainable. They haven't run out of space yet, and before COVID-19 hit, it was estimated that they could bury people for another 80 years. The current problem with expansion of burials on Hart Island is its stigma as a potter's field for the impoverished and unidentified. The artist activist Melinda Hunt started the Hart Island Project to battle this stigma. The island has been managed by the Corrections Department, but as of July 2021, the Parks Department will take over. They should reduce the stigma and open up the island to the public. Plans for expanding green burial across the 100-plus acre island should also include planting trees and other native species to increase resilience, control erosion, and to increase its appeal as a public space.
Ultimately, green burial is completely legal and feasible within NYC limits. Objections based on religious dogma are valid only for a very few percentage of New Yorkers. Lack of burial space, resulting in exceedingly high prices for all earthen burials, and lack of knowledge about green options are the main barriers to green burial. The cost per cemetery plot is upwards of $9,000 in Greenwood Cemetery. Paradoxically, individuals buried in mass graves on Hart Island because of a lack of funds or loved ones to organize a different disposition receive the closest to a green burial in New York City. We recommend advocacy so that funeral directors and cemetery operators promote at least shades of green, normalizing corpses that are not being chemically embalmed, encased in a steel casket, or entombed in a concrete vault. All the more expensive and space-intensive than cremation, shades of green burials help individuals save money and be more environmentally friendly until certified green burial is available. Amending sepulchre laws, allowing for a more efficient use or reuse of current burial and current and remaining burial space in the city, would drastically increase the amount of land for burials. We recommend further exploration of parks and remediated brownfields as new burial grounds or hybrid burial grounds to increase the amount of land available for burials, to reduce the cost of cemetery plots, and to create a more sustainable environment in NYC. I would like to conclude with a quote from the playwright H.G. Wells, who once said, "History is a race between education and catastrophe. And while this year, catastrophe has seemed to be the victor, going forward, education will be the key to green burial expansion in New York City." Thank you.
Okay, at this point, Brian will share his slides and we will take any questions.
Great, thank you, team. I'll start with our guest reviewers. David. Oh, you're muted.
I'm happy to go second. I want to mull it over for a couple of minutes.
Sure. Jim, are you prepared to have some questions or comments?
Yeah, I actually have a whole bunch. First of all, I thought that was a cool presentation, a cool topic. Something completely random. This morning, as I was having breakfast and doing some recreational reading, I came across a story about Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame, which I think at least some of you who are my age will recall. He's buried in a cemetery in Kentucky called Cave Park. And what I found fascinating is that that cemetery has 600 different species of trees. And it made me think, man, that would be an awesome botanical garden. That it would have an alternative use beyond being just a traditional cemetery. So your presentation was really provocative. I'll just share a couple of observations and comments here. I think it's interesting to talk about sustainable or green burial, but I wonder about the sustainability of cemeteries in general, not just the burial itself, but cemeteries strike me to be very similar to golf courses in the way that they are developed and the way they are maintained. So I think the lack of sustainability goes far beyond the burial itself. I also think I was provoked by the legal sort of context in which funeral homes in New York have to be for profit. I wonder if that is common nationwide. I know that the Funeral Home Association that represents them nationally is a very powerful lobby, actually. So it would be interesting to hear about that. Also, last question, I've got many more. I'm interested in the different forms of traditional burial or traditional disposition of the deceased. How does cremation compare, for example, to traditional burial? Which of the two is more sustainable or more green? So thank you again.
Do you want answers to some of those things?
Well, yeah, that's the whole point of it.
Okay, I'm going to start with your last question first. Is cremation more or less sustainable than a traditional burial? Well, first, I'm going to say traditional is not a great word, and we tried very hard not to use that word when we are presenting and doing this project in general, because what does traditional mean? It means something else to different people. So generally we use like standard or conventional, as is practiced today. And yes, cremation is, people think that it is more sustainable because it takes up less space, but that is a misconception. Because of the greenhouse gases and the carbon dioxide that it releases more carbon dioxide than a standard burial. So yes, it is better to do a standard burial than it is to do a cremation.
Debbie, I'd hate to interrupt you, but we actually have a graph with a slide. So Brian, can you go to that chart that we have where it shows all the different kinds of burials and their... It should be further at the beginning. Did we take it out?
Yeah, we took it out.
Oh, okay. Continue.
Okay. That was the answer to that question. Regarding, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Debbie, I threw you off your flow. James, to answer your question, cremation is definitely way more material or resource intensive than traditional burial, simply because it uses natural gas to burn the body. So there's natural gas that goes into the burning of the body, and then the body itself releases, how do you say, pollutants into the air. So it's pollutants twice. It's pollutants as an input and pollutants as an output.
Right, but you have to compare that with the amount of energy and the contamination that goes into fabricating all of the materials that go into a standard burial as well, right?
So, I completely agree with you, but I think the issue between cremation and traditional burial is the fact that cremation is sold as the greener option, and that's what the issue is. The fact that it's advertised as the greener option when it, quite frankly, isn't.
So if I may interject, you know, one of the
Cool.
opportunities for carrying this project further would actually be to do fairly detailed, we can't call it life cycle cost, we could call it death cycle cost accounting. But therein lies a very interesting capstone project if you were to take this, hand it off to another team.
Definitely. But the thing with that is that Death Lab, which is associated with Columbia University, actually did a lot of this. So if you want the specific numbers on the amount of carbon dioxide that regular burial releases and how energy intensive it is, how water intensive it is, they have all of that data, and all that data is also in our paper. They also have all the data for various other disposition methods, including cremation, as well as alternative green methods that are not legal in New York City.
Thank you.
David?
Sure. Well, it's certainly a topic I never thought of before, so I found it really interesting. I have a few comments or questions. The first one is the greenness of some of the green methods that you mentioned. One method that you mentioned was anaerobic digestion. The product of anaerobic digestion is methane. Methane is about 40 to 50 times worse greenhouse gas per molecule than carbon dioxide. So digesting a body into methane is really bad for global warming.
Unless that methane is retrieved and recovered and utilized.
If it is. But I think, Hillary, you're not being examined. They are.
No, I'm saying that is an issue.
Okay, but I would like them to answer, not you.
Yes. In this specific case, it's actually called biomethanization. If it's used for something else, it's anaerobic decomposition, but they're essentially the same process. The EPA, they describe the process as once the methane is produced, and then I believe it's also digestate as well, which is either a solid or liquid form. That's captured, and that's either used as fertilizer, and then the methane could be used as a biogas to fuel either homes or offices for electricity.
Okay. Now, you know, what I didn't catch was the distinction between a marked graves and essentially like a dispersal with no marked graves. You know, when you're talking about the customs or the religious groups and their objections or non-objections, generally, for example, in Christian groups, there's the open casket viewing. And what I'm wondering is if that can be done in a way that is green, because generally open casket viewing is not done within a few hours of the person's death, but days later, and without some sort of, I guess the body could be refrigerated. I just don't know if you can have open casket viewing without any sort of cross-linking, which is done by the aldehydes. You know, at least, so that's in the Christian tradition. In the Jewish tradition, there's the issue of, you know, if you want to use sites in public parks, there's this issue of not doing anything on a burial ground. So, for example, the reflecting ponds at the World Trade Center site are at the, they're on where the footprints are of the original World Trade Center. And the reason for that was there was a rabbinic objection to building on a graveyard. And they took the footprints of the original World Trade Center sites as effectively a graveyard. So that's why they're reflecting ponds. So to have it in at the beginning, you were saying it was only 3% of the population that would have any objections to this type of green burial. And that I seem to see a conflict with both Christians and Jews. Let's see what else.
Okay, I will start with the Jewish tradition. The Christian
I just
tradition.
want to interject and remind the group we're sort of time sensitive, so if we can have crisp questions and crisp responses, that will really aid our evening. Thank you.
Okay, regarding if you can have an open casket viewing, yes, you can, because there are more sustainable embalming fluids. Well, there is one embalming fluid that does not contain formaldehyde or heavy chemicals, which can be used in a green burial, and you can also use dry ice.